Alright, so today we're going to be talking about Plato's Sophist, sections 237 to 249. Our main concepts are going to be um, the Parmenidean problem about how we can say what is not if it is not, right? The very beginning, we're confronting this core Parmenidean puzzle. How can we even refer to that which is not without contradiction? Um, and what I'm going to do is go through these sections quite quickly, and then I'll slowly go through some of the important parts that we may have accidentally skipped over. Um, so quickly, in the beginning of the sections that we read today, the stranger says something along the lines of, "To that which is, there might belong some other of those which are." Now, what that means is that difference between substance and the qualities of the substance do exist. So I could have this one bottle. However, this bottle has different qualities, a plurality of qualities, right? Or something like a mereological sum. So, what's interesting about this is right beforehand, it says that it never will force upon us that which is not may be, right? Parmenides has told us that it's never the case that which is not can actually exist, but it seems that we hold the opposite. Anywhere we would apply the phrase that which is not, because it seems like we can't even talk about what is not since it doesn't exist. And obviously, that which is not cannot be applied to that which is. So, no matter what, we're not going to be able to apply that which is not to something, because something is a specific thing, and a thing is a being, and that which is not analytically is not being. You can't isolate something from being. Something, um, in the very beginning of the sections we've read, it said something is one thing, a couple thing and two things. Some things is a plurality of things. So to not say something is to say nothing at all. And so if not, something is not one thing, then not one thing is nothing, right? This is sounding very confusing right off the bat. And the thing is, oppositely, oh wow, it would be irrational if we had to conclude that even speaking the phrase that which is not speaking. So how are we going to get around um, this issue here? It's I personally think, and this is definitely informed by Mary Louise Gill, that this is Plato's move to show that language can't actually avoid ontological commitments. Even negation will invoke a sort of minimal mode of being as a sort of concept or a relational mark. So even denying that which is not will force us to name it and treat it as a kind of unity or plurality, thus smuggling in some sort of being. Um, we see early in these readings that the utterability of that which is not is problematic. How is it unutterable, unthinkable, unsayable? We see the stranger say that and then take it back right after. Um, because just to deny it, just to speak its denial, is to speak of it. So saying it cannot be spoken is itself speaking of it. There's a sort of dramatic irony here, right? There's a linguistic trap of sorts that the stranger points to us. If we were talking about a sophist right now, or to a sophist right now, he would exploit this contradiction just strictly to escape definition. Because, I mean, strictly by refuting the ability to speak about non being, the sophists could claim they're just not being criticized. Um, because how am I going to criticize the person who I claim speaks what is not, right? That would make no sense. So now we have to prove that which is not is somehow is. Um, so the stranger asks Theaetetus, "Well, what's going on here? Can you see how we can get out of this?" Um, and Theaetetus answers, "It's possible that we're talking about a copy here." Um, but then the sophist will obviously ask, "What is a copy?" And Theaetetus says that it's something that's made similar to a true thing and is another thing that's like it. But the visitor quickly tells him, so you're saying it's another true thing like it, or what do you mean by like it? And Theaetetus quickly tells us, no, what I mean is that it's not true at all. It just resembles that true thing. It's sort of contrary of true. Um, it has a likeness and it lacks aletheia. Aletheia is the Greek word for truth. It holds a bit of different presuppositions, but for our purposes today, um, it just means truth. So a copy has likeness but lacks truth. The key point here is that the copy is not the true thing that it imitates. It just borrows being, but it doesn't. I should say maybe have it fully. Um, so it's kind of similar to Plato's view of opinions in the Middle Period, where it's a sort of mix, right? It both is and is not. There's not being both woven with being, which is exactly the opening that Plato is trying to get against Parmenides here. This is where we're going to start to develop this sort of theory of non-being and a theory of falsehood, where non-being isn't something that is nothingness. It's more so, I should say, maybe an ontological otherness, what Plato calls heteron, or a difference. Um, and then the stranger kind of asks us. Sorry, guys. When I say the stranger and the visitor, I mean the same person. Um, but the stranger kind of asks Theaetetus, please don't look at me as committing a parricide, um, because he's attacking the person who's taught him, right? We know that the stranger is Eleatically trained. Parmenides is the father of Eleatic philosophy. On top of that, in the Greek context, killing one's father is an ultimate taboo, which really emphasizes the boldness of Plato's move here. Having the stranger basically kill his metaphorical father, that's going to, especially knowing that Parmenides is deeply revered and respected. Um, I mean, we see even Plato treating his monism as quite foundational and sacred. However, it's clear that to move forward in this dialogue, Plato and the interlocutors, they must overcome it. We need to become more intellectually mature and independent. Um, and some scholars have even suggested that this parricide signals Plato's transition from honoring the pre-Socratic thinkers to actually superseding them with a new higher and dialectical metaphysics. So how are we going to go against Parmenides here? This is the big question. Um, we need to somehow show uh, that being cannot be that being cannot be one. Right? If being is one, then there should be no multiplicity. But when we give one a name, it implies a distinction, right? If being is one, or we give one this, if we equate one to being, then it becomes two, right? We wouldn't be able to have a name and a separate entity under Parmenidean monism. It'll just collapse into an infinite regress of differences, right? Naming introduces difference even within one. Um, right, and the Greek nuance of it is that we use different words, or the Greeks use different words for both one and name. They use the word onoma for name and en for one. So the stranger will just kind of shows that using one as a name presupposes the existence of um, a sort of relational power or a sort of potentiality, right? Not to be confused with Aristotelian potentiality, um, but there's a sort of capacity by which the one can be thought or spoken of. Um, now, it's possible that this argument shows that language necessarily involves difference in relation, requiring this space for non-being to be understood as difference, but we'll get into that quite soon. Now, there's also the sphere argument against Parmenides. That was the name argument that we just went over. Um, Before I get into the sphere argument, I'll quickly reconstruct that naming argument. It basically just concludes that one and being, whether the names refer to the same thing or not, as two separate words will embrace pluralism, and a true monist would only need one name. Since the monists are using two separate words to refer to being, they do introduce plurality, which in itself concludes that this theory of monism can be rejected. And furthermore, monists can't say names and what they reference are two different things, because that as well will embrace pluralism. So we see two sides to this argument to get rid of Parmenides claiming that being and one are the same. Now, Parmenides also says being is like a perfect sphere. It's whole, it's undivided, it's uniform. We see in the text, it says specifically, it gives us a Parmenidean quote at 244 E3 to E6, right? All around, like the bulk of a well-formed sphere, equal balanced always from the middle, since neither anything more must it be this way or that way, nor anything less. So if being is a sphere, um, then the stranger will tell us, well, it must have two things at the very least, right? It must have a center and extremities, and it must have parts that relate to each other in some sort of way. Um, Now, since Parmenides himself uses a sphere to explain the quality of wholeness and being, the stranger tells us that it must have a middle and extremities, right? Um, and the stranger will definitely grant for us in the dialogue that what is truly one, properly speaking, has to be completely without parts. Um, I think that's important because right after, the stranger goes on to conclude that a being with no parts doesn't actually fit the account that was given to what a whole is in Parmenides' poem. Um, so consequently, this allows for the conclusion that being and wholeness must have two separate natures. Um, Being cannot be purely one or purely whole in the Parmenidean sense. It must contain some sort of internal differentiation, right? Um, and the sphere metaphor seems to dramatize how physical metaphors fail when applied strictly to pure being, as this thing that might be transcendental or very relational. Um, Now, another account is that whatever becomes must at some point become a whole, or a whole being. So we can't label either being or becoming as something that exists without taking wholeness as existent as well. So what is not whole cannot have quantity at all, since anything of any quantity has to be a whole of that quantity, right? 1 inch must be one whole inch, or it can't claim to be 1 inch. Um, so in showing that anything with the quality of wholeness must have parts, anything that exists must become whole, and anything with quantity, that is the monist one being, must also be a whole of that quantity, it seems that the stranger just now committed parricide. Um, and maybe Plato has finally superseded the pre-Socratic. Right. A further paradox is if being and one are the same, there's no reason to call them different names, but we do, right? So they must not be identical. Um, there's a sort of focus on capacity and power, right? It implies that being isn't sort of static. It involves the capacity to be thought, the power to be thought about, to be named, to be interacted with. So naming and being are relational things. They're not identical things. The capacity to be named implies that being is not an indivisible one. Now, an example of co-being that we get in, I think it's 244E, is this idea of hot and cold. Both hot and cold are, yet they are different. Being isn't going to be exhausted by this one property, right? To say that both are is already acknowledging a plurality in being. Um, so Plato here is showing us with a simple example that um, opposites can be co-present, which is a bit closer to a Heraclitean idea than a Parmenidean idea. Um, but that's not what Plato wants to settle with here. So finally, after we get rid of Parmenides, we get to the section called the Battle of Gods and Giants. And this is going to be our last section that we go over today, where Plato really dramatizes the cosmological and ontological debate as this sort of battle between two warring camps, right? He calls them the materialists or the giants and the friends of forms, or the gods, right? The materialists believe that being is entirely perceptible, entirely bodily, while the forms, the friends of the forms, the gods, they believe being is immaterial and intelligible. Um, so the giants, they refuse to admit anything invisible is real. Only touchable, corporeal, perceptible things are things that exist. But that denies being to something like the soul, to conceptions like justice, beauty, knowledge. But on the other hand, um, the friends of the forms, they believe in justice, beauty, virtue, intellect, and regard sensible things as less real, even though they're right in front of us. If being is purely changeless, according to the friends of the forms, then it cannot interact or know. Um, so if we've already defined being as something that has the power to act or be acted upon, it seems that we need to move our ontology of being away from static essence, right, to a sort of relational capacity. We need to unify change and with stability. How are we going to do that? Um, Plato is going to propose here, instead of, say, the Eleatic concept of changelessness or the flux Heraclitean concept, let's propose something a little bit more inclusive. And that is this idea of capacity. Um, this capacity account preserves continuity with, say, earlier Greek metaphysics, while introducing a new innovative concept, relationality. Um, so this battle between these two camps dramatizes this theoretical dispute, with a deep philosophical need to transcend oppositional thinking of earlier schools. We're here arguing that Plato is embracing a new metaphysics to save dialectic in a way, right? By defining being as a sort of capacity, we're going to safeguard the possibility of logos, of interaction, of learning, and it allows for falsehood and appearance to be possible once again without falling into nihilism, which is what we were worried about last week. Um, so some of the key takeaways before I go really in depth to these sections, is that naming will always imply a difference. So not being is as real as difference. Um, the sphere argument, too. Absolute unity cannot account for inner structure. Being must always contain parts. Um, now, the existence of opposites within being will prove that internal multiplicity, right? Um, and also that being is a sort of relational power. It allows for both stability and change, which we'll get into a bit more next week. Um, but it's also going to allow for interaction, for identification, for predication, right? So we see Plato creating this sort of philosophical revolution that not being is no longer non-existence, but it's a sort of difference, which will enable us to allow the existence of copies, of false speech, of even sophistry. Um, Now, what do we think, guys, before I go into a little bit more in depth?
So I guess the question is, in his rejection of these of the monism, is it the introduction of a new metaphysical system that he's trying to construct, or is it still purely a critical argument?
Well, it's definitely a little bit of both, right? In this section, we're strictly, no, I wouldn't say strictly, we're definitely implying um, some more things, but it really does seem like at first we're tearing down what we knew before so we can start building up. With everything that we learned in tearing things down, we can apply that to this new metaphysical system um, that we're about to create. Now, we still do have a good bit of the dialogue, and everything that's going to come after this in the dialogue is going to be that new construction of Plato's theory. Um, right, the Parmenidean prohibition of that which is not. Parmenides declared it to be unutterable, unsayable, unthinkable. So here we're just going to show the issues of the Parmenidean argument, the issues of um, the argument of the theory of the forms, and the issues of the materialist argument. But in doing so, in refuting those arguments, um, we're going to learn some things. And, Plato hasn't officially declared what being is constructed out of, but we seem to be implying this entire time that the ban of speaking of not being is self-defeating, right? Even negation involves reference. Even reference implies minimal sorts of being. Um, because just saying, you're kind of forced to speak the unspeakable, right? If we want to deny non-being. Um, to say that which is not cannot be spoken of is itself a statement about that which is not. So at the very least, you're affirming something linguistically. Um, and now we're absolutely refuting the pre-Socratics or other theories that came before this. But in doing so, we are accepting and creating a new foundation that not being can actually be spoken of, just not as absolute non-existence, but as a sort of difference. Um, does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah. Um, I mean, I guess when he says that it's different than non-being in the Parmenidean sense, uh, is he basically saying that it still exists in a different way, like with reference to something else? Like its lack of, I guess, being there?
Um, yeah, I think he's saying, at least the way that I've interpreted it, um, is that non-being, anytime it's spoken of, arises in relation to something else. Now, I don't want to get too far into it because that's kind of, you're asking me to go into next week. But
Hmm.
anytime we reference that which is not, we're referencing it in relation to something that is, right? Um, to say even something simple like now we're gonna have to get into the difference between identity and predication here momentarily. Um, but say the pencil is not a book. We are predicating non-being onto the pencil by saying it's not identical to the book. Um, but clearly, non-being still does exist in a way in that sense. There is non-being in everything that is, insofar as it's not it's something different than itself, right?
Mhm.
So that's kind of say when we were talking about the copies earlier, right? The copy is like the original, but it's not the same as it, right? And this is going to get into what we kind of thought maybe sophistry was doing. It resembles something, right? What is not resembles being, but it lacks that full truth, right? It seems like true being has to be something that's fully real, and a copy, say what the sophists do in their speech, is not. It's what is not. Um, but it has some derivative being as an image, right? The copy is not the original thing, yet it is insofar as it resembles something, right? So that copy is both, or sorry, both is and is not. I really have to figure out how to word these kinds of things because it's very is, and is not, and so it can get confusing. Um, but the copy, for example, or the reference embodies not being as difference rather than as nothingness, right? That sophist, he deals in verbal copies, like we saw last week, um, right? Arguments that appear to be true but are not. So it seems that the sophist's expertise that we couldn't get a hold on might be in manipulating that interplay between being and seeming. Um, so it becomes possible once not being is understood as a sort of difference. Um, and that's kind of where we got last week when we said, oh, it seems that the sophist might be a sort of verbal magician, a verbal illusionist, something like that. Um, so it's a sort of say the part about parricide, for example, right? It's a very radical break. Because of the cultural weight that it holds, right? Killing the father in Greek culture is probably one of the most ultimate transgressions. Um, but Plato recognizes for the sake of knowledge and dialectic that we need to overcome Parmenides. Um, it's a sort of honor killing of sorts, right? To put it metaphorically. Um, which symbolizes that transition, like I said, from the pre-Socratic wisdom um, to transcending it. And that's what we're going to do next week. We're going to create a sort of new metaphysical structure. Um, does that kind of help?
Oh, definitely. I think I got a way clearer picture of it now.
Um, I also want to talk a little bit about an interesting um, idea that comes from the significance of the character of the stranger in arguing against Parmenides. Now remember, the stranger, he's from the city of Elea, where Parmenides is from. So Plato actually veers away in this dialogue from using Socrates as his primary speaker to reject Parmenides. He's going to use someone from the city of Parmenides, and I think that's of significant importance. Um, the stranger is already called a almost a divine philosopher in the very first few lines of the Sophist. And Plato tries to close the gap for any room of misinterpretation of the Parmenidean doctrine. Um, and we we need to remember, because of that, there's no reason to consider the stranger would want to strawman Parmenides here. Um, Even though he insisted by brute force that that which is not somehow is, and that which is somehow is not. Um, Especially considering Parmenides actually taught what is not to be forbidden, like we said earlier. Um, on top of that, the stranger is probably the most well versed on the subject of Parmenidean monism more than any other person in the Platonic dialogues, apart from Parmenides and Zeno from the Parmenides. Once we consider his status and his origin, right? Um, Now that doesn't speak on whether um, the argument was taken literally or metaphorically. The one argument, the one name argument, and the sphere argument that he goes against. Um, but it definitely does admit that we are taking Parmenides serious, very serious in this dialogue, if that wasn't obvious enough. So I'll go over that name argument just one more time because it is very, very, very difficult. But if being is entirely one, then there can be no multiplicity, right? There can't be any distinctions, any names, anything of that sort. However, that's problematic. We use one and being as separate names. So naming already presupposes a difference. Names are different from what they reference, what they name. So if one and being are identical, there wouldn't be a need for separate names. But that's exactly what the Parmenidean um, Parmenideans do, or what that doctrine says, that one and being are identical. Um, However, because we have those two different names, they're clearly not identical. Um, so Plato's stressing that using one as a name already implies some sort of relational capacity that implies difference. Now, a very amazing um, scholar, Paulo Crivelli, what he thinks here is that not the only, but a very big thing that Plato's showing here in this argument is that pure monism cannot account for the basic functionality of language. And I think every single one of us here would agree with that. Um, a pure monism would have to sound something like being, 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 if it can even account for sounds too, right? Anything. Um, what do we think of that naming argument? Do we think it's a stupid argument? Um, do we think it's maybe strawmanning Parmenides?
Well, I think one like initial problem I'd have is couldn't you say that those names do refer to the same thing? I guess this is in light of like other philosophical developments, but they just have a different sense, like a different mode of presentation. If that makes sense. I don't know if that doesn't work in light of like saying everything is being.
So you're saying both the perception and the name refer to the same thing, but that thing isn't the perception or the name?
Oh, sorry. Sorry. I'm a little confused. I thought you were saying that there's a distinction between um, the name of like of being and unity, or have I? I'm sorry. This is if I've mangled what you said.
Um, so what Parmenides does is claim that one and being are identical.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
Now what Plato says is that we're already using one and being as separate names, and
Mhm.
um, under the Platonic account and most accepted accounts of language, names are something different from what they're referencing, right? There's um, a speech act of sorts, and then there's the
Mhm.
reference point, right? Now, however, if one and being are identical, there wouldn't be a need for separate names. Um, Now, this is more so from the linguistic point of view than the ontological point of view. Um,
Mhm.
but in light of us naming one and being as two different things, like we don't have the same name for something that is one and something that is being, right? While it refers to a
Mhm.
quality of a thing, it's not the exact same quality of sorts, right? Um, so clearly, one and being can't be identical. I can call um, a bucket of corn as something that is, as being, but I can't call it one unless I'm referring to the one bucket it's held in, um, because there's a multiplicity of corn in that bucket, right? Um, so what Plato's trying to stress here is that using one as a name or using anything as a name is already going to involve that relational act, right? Um, that there's a difference between the name and the thing it's referencing. In that sense, that's why monism can't account for functionality of language. Um, because it seems like the basic functionality of language is to reference things, right? At least,
Mhm.
does that kind of help?
Yeah, I guess what, what I'm meaning is like, and I don't know if this would work with something like unity and being, but like, do you know the example like like Frege gives between like the morning star, like the evening star, in the sense that they they have like different senses, but they're still referencing the same object. Um, and so I guess is there? I guess what I'm asking is there a way in which you could attempt to say like to question Plato and saying like although these are like these are two distinct names, that doesn't follow that they don't have to be referencing something different.
Um,
I don't know.
I think this emphasis of relation that we're seeing might help us cover those bases. Maybe it's
Mhm,
possible that when you say the morning star and the evening star, even though it references that same star, um, you already are naming it something different because of the relation that it has to the time of day. You know,
mhm.
so maybe Plato could get around you in that sense. That a very big ish way to get around it is that even though it references the same object, it references the same object in different ways, and in that different way being a temporal difference.
Okay, yeah,
Um,
that makes sense because it would have to be related. Like even like um the example like Frege gives between like the points of a triangle. The point in saying that would be saying they're related differently, right?
right,
Necessarily. So there would have to be some sense of difference in between them.
exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Um, I'll go over the sphere argument too one more time before I get into the battle of gods and giants again, because sphere argument is kind of odd. Um, Now remember that Parmenides is likening being to a perfect sphere, something that's uniform, something that's complete, something that has zero parts. But that's problematic. Why? Because the sphere seems to have a center, has extremities. Um, so it seems to have parts. However, if what is truly one can't have parts because it's just one. Um, so that's already the first problem with a sphere and being the same. Um, any whole sphere implies parts, right? Something is whole because it is composed of everything that composes it. Um, so Plato isn't saying that being can't be whole. Um, he's more so saying that being can't simply be whole in a strict sense. Um, and being and wholeness aren't really synonymous with each other. Because if one is identical to being, or if wholeness is identical to being, um, then it can never be one, right? So in this argument, at the very least, we've shown that what is whole must have parts, that what is one is without parts, and we can't combine these two statements, right? Especially within the ontology of Parmenides, um, because being to be completely without parts cannot allow being to be a whole, since what is whole implies parts, which is what monism can't maintain here. Um, does that make any sense? It's a very mereological argument for sure. Um,
I don't know if you're asking in general or to the other person, but I think that makes a lot of sense. The way that I mean, I know that there are some discussions from people like Ted Sider about being able to reconstruct mathematics without mereology, but it still has to permit things like set theory or sets in
Right.
general, which I imagine Parmenides would still count as a separate entity, kind of like a mereology.
Right. No, absolutely. It seems that if being has wholeness as a property, as its own property, then being and wholeness already have to be two distinct concepts. To possess something already means it's separate from itself, right? If I possess this pencil, um, then the pencil is something separate from me. And that's not just on the physical level, right? But if I am nice or I am mean, then I possess the quality of being mean or the quality of being nice, which already implies that I and niceness or meanness are distinct things, right? Um, Basically, to be whole, in the sense of this sphere, um, then being would already require something outside of itself to measure to define its own completeness. Um, so what um, some scholars argue is that this twofold argument actually forces a shift to this sort of ontology where being and non-being, or like we've been saying this entire time, where being and difference can coexist. Um, and how do we do that? The hot and cold example we said earlier. Both hot and cold exist, they both are, but they're not the same at all. However, they both are. They're both being, but they're not the same. They're already not, right? So being isn't something that's limited to a single uniform entity, but it's something that's distributed among different forms, right? Multiplicity within being already shows us that strict monism is false. Even though these opposing qualities can both share in something, what do they share? In existence, in being. So being will already involve that capacity for a relational difference. Um, and it seems like now we're making this link that might be very ahead of its time, right? This metaphysical differentiation with a perceptual reality, right? It's sort of, one might call it a phenomenological step of sorts. What do we think so far?
I mean, it definitely sounds like a something that would have only been come up with in the last couple centuries. So the idea that Plato would already be introducing us into this type of ontological realm is really interesting.
Yeah, people need to give him more credit, right?
I mean, we've been saying Aristotle has been the big philosopher, but it might have been Plato.
um, all right, before I completely open it up, I'll go over the Battle of Gods and Giants one more time. So we've already said that Plato introduced this mythical battle to dramatize ontological positions, right? The giants and the gods, right? These giants are these materialists, and the gods were the idealists. Um, and our giants, they deny reality to incorporeal objects. Reality must be tangible, must be solid. Um, if it's being, then it has a body, and the capacity of things is limited to their physical properties. But the gods insist that true being is, the forms. They're eternal, unchanging, and accessible only to reason. And they deny that true being undergoes any change. Now, there's obviously problems with both of these positions. Um, Now, in the dialogue, we see the stranger hinting that the gods are a bit better than the giants. He seems to like the account of the theory of forms better than the materialist account. Now, does he think it's right? Absolutely not. Does he think it's nicer and easier to talk to and talk about? Yes. Um, but that's just a little side quest, right? So here we see a new definition, right? That which is we say, is nothing else but capacity to act or be acted upon, right? So, um, it seems like we're redefining being here as a sort of capacity. Um, Being is defined functionally, not as pure stasis or pure flux like the pre-Socratics did. Being can be either stable or changing, as long as its relational capacity is there. Um, right? Plato is innovating by mediating between extremes, right? So this sort of capacity definition allows for interaction and stability. Um, and rather than Plato taking the side of materialists or taking the side of idealists, he actually removes a sort of false dichotomy. He sets the stage for a sort of dialectical synthesis. The philosopher becomes this mediator who reconciles both change and rest. Um, this opens room for explaining how forms interact with souls, how knowledge is possible, how falsehood can exist. Um, Now, remember, sophistry depended on that interplay between being and appearance. So now we can actually justify how sophists can manipulate speech and belief. They play with those relational capacities. Um, so Plato was moving here from um, a static unity or a consistent change to dynamic relationality. We're rehabilitating non-being to make falsehood possible in an ontological way, right? Um, the philosopher kind of weaves these kinds together, and how do I say this? He sort of transcends um, being partial to one side. So to recap everything that we've said, um, right, negating being already invokes being itself. So that which is not cannot be completely excluded. Even uttering that which is not proves a minimal sort of being through naming it, right? Um, Another thing, copies are things that lack truth, but they share partial being. What else did we go over? That we had to break away from Parmenides and prove him wrong to progress ontologically and dialectically. Now, those naming and sphere arguments show that inevitability of difference and relationality, right? And lastly, that battle of gods and giants required this sort of dialectical synthesis using that new definition of being. Um, so we integrate these pre-Socratic insights to a relational dynamic ontology that justifies the possibility of error, appearance, and sophistry while preserving truth and dialectic. All right. What do you guys think?
I mean, this is like, that how people talk about philosophers as their, oh, I had this intuition and that guy just got to it first kind of thing.
Yeah.
I feel like Plato laid a lot of the groundworks in this interpretation for a lot of the ways that we've talked about metaphysics or ontology or anything like that. And I would have never once thought to bring it back to here. So seeing the roots so deeply embedded in the, original roots of our ontological discussions, I mean, it's just like, it's one of those things where you're seeing a lot more to the picture than you did before, and it's starting to make a lot more sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a big reason for that is, as far as I know, in somebody's intro class to Plato or in a sort of undergraduate class, people don't really teach the late period dialogues because they're very, very difficult to read. Um, they're very difficult to get through, and that not isn't 100% true. It's definitely some people might teach it, but when someone teaches Plato, they teach this middle period theory of the forms and his ethical insights from the early period. The Sophists falling into the late period seems to be a lot more similar to Aristotle or even later thinkers, and it doesn't really get too much attention until grad school or even later.
Which is surprising because whenever we are taught the theory of the forms, we teach it as if, or at least as far as I'm aware, we teach it as if Plato is this very static, almost anti-dynamic philosopher. Like the things that the true reality is a static, absolute reality of the forms, and there's almost no credence given to this dynamic interpretation of him.
No, absolutely.
That's what when reading it, that's what struck me the most when he started kind of referring to the forms almost in like this third person sense. I was like, what? This has always been like the center, I guess, presentation of it to me. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. It does seem like he's kind of backing away from what he used to hold as plausible, right? As what he actually used to hold as fact. Everything that we knew in the Republic as Plato's theory seems to be pushed aside to somebody else's position.
I wanted to ask about that though. Is there a way in which, at least the way you kind of set it up in the conclusion, in which at least a lot of the conclusions that like Plato arises, say about like politics or ethics, in the Republic, is there a way that they could kind of be rescued through this ontology? But this like in the sense of like there's more say like a more of a primacy given to things like intelligible forms, but it's more so accounting for how there could be an existence of like what the sophist does or like how something like non-being can exist if like what I'm asking makes sense.
You're asking kind of, does Plato allow transcendental things in this theory that he's putting forward here or will put forward?
Yeah, and does that allow him to kind of, in a sense, maintain a lot of the conclusions that would be given in like his earlier works? I don't
I think
like.
so. I definitely think so, right? We're not denying forms exist and we're not denying material exists. We're denying um that what we said earlier of how they exist in a strict sense, that it was the most real, right? Both ideas and forms and, corporeal objects, they're all real. Um but we define them relationally, right? They have different sorts of capacities. They have different powers in a sort of sense, right? We don't need to deny
Okay.
one over the other. We don't need to give primacy to one over the other.
So,
I guess what I'd be asking. Oh, sorry. No. You can go. Sorry.
no, it seems like you were doing a follow-up. I can ask mine after.
Oh yeah. I guess what I'm wondering is like, say for example, I don't know what book it is in the Republic when he's talking about like the regimes and like analogizing it with like the types of souls. Um, and I guess maybe this wouldn't work. I guess um it seems like there was this, and it's been a while since I read it, but there's this big distinction between like the disunity of say like the tyrannical soul or like the democratic soul, that has this kind of like always changing desire. Seems a lot analog to like seems to be very analog to um, the rejection of becoming metaphysically, and then there's this kind of appraisal of like the unity of the polis or of the soul. And I'm just wondering, in this kind of like relational ontology as you presented it, could you still maintain, if I'm even right to say that the distinction has this character, could you retain such a distinction? Like if things like material becoming or body becoming and like these disembodied forms aren't given primacy?
I I definitely do think that could be the case for sure. Just because we'll see that what is becoming, and we already saw a bit of it here, is still being in a way, um, or sort of on its way to being at the very least, right?
Mhm,
When something is becoming, it already parts of it are already parts of it already are. Um,
mhm,
right? You can't have being without becoming. Um, at all, right? Whatever becomes must at some point become a whole being, a being itself. Um, so we can't label either being or becoming um, as exclusive. Um, now, would that possibly deny, um, unless you look more into it, the idea of eternal concepts? Maybe, unless it's a sort of ontological becoming over a temporal becoming, right?
mhm,
Um, so I don't think that, the count in the Republic is exactly what we need to go by. Um, but I don't think that the insights we gain from the Republic can't also be had under this new account here, especially just because the point of, the battle of the gods and giants is to more so show you both are right. You just got there
mhm,
wrong. Right? You innovated, or Plato is innovating by that mediation point, right? Mediating between extremes, right? The forms and the materialists, um, which is exactly why we redefine being and redefine non-being. Right, this battle between gods and giants sets that stage for a synthesis between those two sides, rather than, you know saying either the forms are correct or the materials are correct, right?
mhm. Okay, thank you. I think that makes more sense to me, like how those would relate.
All right, well, is any last questions before we wrap up here?
Yeah. So I guess my question then is, how does Plato treat these notions of being and becoming? Because are we going to run into the Heideggerian contradiction of being as the thing that gives things being? So what is it itself, if not? If that makes sense. I'm not familiar with the phrasing of it.
um you're basically predicting what we're going to talk about next week. I'm not going to lie to you.
Oh,
um
sweet.
so I will save that for next week. And if you still have that question, then let me know. But I do think
Absolutely.
that next week will really clear up any sort of confusions you might still have.
Okay, thanks. I'll definitely be reading that then.
Alright, well, I will be ending the recording here. Thank you guys, and whoever made it to the end of the recording, thanks for watching. Bye!